Dear colleagues, dear partners, bonjour, hello, grüezi. We at the Data Science Competence Center of the Swiss Federal Statistical Office are very happy to welcome you to our webinar series, Data Science and AI for Public Good. My name is Kirsten Johansson-Baker, and I am head of the Competence Network for AI unit here at the Federal Statistical Office, and I will be your moderator today. If you wish to ask questions to the speaker, please submit them on mentimeter.com. You can use the link that you got in the email invitation. Otherwise, you can also find that link in the description part below this video. We are absolutely thrilled to have Dr. Courtney Bowman with us today. And his talk is entitled The Limits of AI, an overview of the history and philosophy of artificial thinking. Dr. Bowman is Global Director of Privacy and Civil Liberties at Palantir Technologies. His work addresses the confluence of issues at the intersection of policy, law, technology, ethics, and social norms. In his role, Dr. Bowman also works with the privacy advocacy world at large, and he is also the co-author of the book, The Architecture of Privacy, which provides a multidisciplinary framework for designing and building privacy-protective information systems. Prior to Palantir, Dr. Bowman earned degrees in physics and philosophy at Stanford University and worked as a quantitative and economic analyst at Google. Dr. Bowman is a frequent commentator on issues surrounding AI ethics, efficacy, and operationalization. It's in his private capacity that Dr. Bowman speaks today. Courtney, thanks again for being with us today. The floor is yours.
And thank you, and apologies for the delay. I appreciate everyone's patience. Let me pull up my slides so that I can begin sharing. And just to reemphasize, I am speaking in my personal capacity today. The views and ideas that I'll be expressing don't represent the opinions of Palantir Technologies, but they are my own reflections on my experience working in the technology field for the better part of the last 20 years. So I'm going to try to move rather quickly, given that we're having a bit of a late start. But I'm going to give you a quick outline. I'll already introduce myself, but the topic that I'm going to cover is a bit of a philosophical discourse and a history of artificial intelligence. And what will be noticeably missing from this discussion is a rich discourse on AI ethics. And that's not because I believe that AI ethics are unimportant. Quite the contrary. The point that I aim to draw out in the course of this discussion is that there are more preliminary matters that need to be addressed in the space of philosophical considerations such as epistemology and metaphysics before we can better ground a lot of the discourse around AI ethics. I'm going to walk through a quick game that I usually play as an interactive exercise, but since we can't do it interactively, you'll sort of pretend that you're playing along at home. I'll do hopefully a quick overview of AI history or key points in AI history, and then I'll jump into the kind of philosophical part of this discussion, starting with the Turing test, a refresher on that, the Chinese room experiment or thought experiment by John Searle, and then a deeper philosophical critique that touches on some themes in phenomenology. I'll say a bit about generative AI as an extension of some of the arguments that I make earlier in the talk. I'll round out with some overview considerations around the limits of artificial intelligence as drawn out in the discussion, and then close with some concluding thoughts before we get into the question and answer part of the presentation. So the game here that I want to open with is a game of Guess the Year. And again, since we can't interact, just sort of play along at home. I'm throwing up a series of quotations. I want you to think about when these statements have been made. So the first being, within 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. This is actually a remark made by early pioneers in the field of artificial intelligence, Simon and Newell in 1958. The reality, as we know, was it wasn't until 1997 that IBM's Deep Blue defeated Garry Kasparov in a rematch in New York City, becoming the world's chess champion. But early indication that some of our estimations on AI capabilities were far ahead of the reality of the technology. Second one, quote, machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. This was a statement, again, made by Simon in 1965. Obviously, here we are in 2023. So this is clearly optimistic. Another one, and you'll start to pick up the theme, within a generation, few compartments of intellect will remain outside machines' realm. The problem of creating artificial intelligence will be substantially solved. This is a quote by Marvin Minsky, an AI pioneer and a robotics pioneer in 1967. Minsky makes another remark: in 3 to 8 years, we'll have a machine that will have general intelligence of an average human being. Again, wildly optimistic in terms of the actual capabilities. And then this is another one that might feel a bit familiar to folks. I consider autonomous driving to be basically a solved problem. This is a statement made by none other than Elon Musk in 2016. Again, we're 2023. We haven't quite solved this problem yet, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. This raises the question of, why do we tend to be so optimistic about the prospects of artificial intelligence? And I think a guiding thought here was originally framed by Bar Hillel in 1966 that I think is quite illuminating. He referred to this as the first step fallacy, the idea that you make a small step and it seems like it's indicative of running the full distance to solving a problem. But in fact, the more intricate aspects of solving complex problems tend to be much more complicated, require quite a bit more time, and lead to this fallacious way of navigating technology development around artificial intelligence. This is a concept that was further articulated by Hubert Dreyfus, a philosopher that I'll say a bit more about later on in the talk, and by his brother, with whom he co-wrote a book, in a phrase that I think is particularly poignant. It's like claiming that the first monkey that climbed a tree was making progress towards flight to the moon. There's clearly a chasm between climbing a few branches on a tree and actually breaking the Earth's orbit, but yet it seems like, and this is something that artificial intelligence engineers often fall into as a trapped way of thinking about their prospects of developing the technology they work on. So, starting the overview of a modern history of artificial intelligence, I will remark that this is not comprehensive. I'm hitting on some keynotes to bear out a narrative that I think is important, but I will acknowledge that I don't exhaustively cover every aspect of artificial intelligence. But it is generally recognized that the modern era of artificial intelligence, the dawn of the golden age, begins with the Dartmouth Conference. In 1956, the conference was really built around this conjecture that aspects of learning and other features of intelligence can be simulated by machines. This conjecture was motivated by developments in neuroscience and neurophysiology, suggesting that humans were starting to get a pretty good grasp on how neurons and the brain operated, and led to thinking that perhaps some of these operations can be modeled in machines, especially at a phase where early transistors were starting to create a boom in the computing industry. So from 57 to 62, we have what commentator Bruce Buchanan referred to as the tool building period, working on different types of cognitive simulation, language translation, problem solving, pattern recognition, really kind of small puzzle development, but building tools that were intended to create more progress towards a larger vision of artificial intelligence. Then we get into, from 62 to 67, what I refer to as the semantic information processing period. Other people have referred to this as GoFi, or good old-fashioned AI, where AI attempts were really focused on symbolic systems, ideas, and taking what we assume to be the operational patterns of human thought, building those into heuristics or rule of thumb processes, and then programming those processes in computer programs. But the pessimistic signs started to emerge in 73 with the Lighthill report by the British government, as well as cutbacks from DARPA in the U.S. government, providing research to entrepreneurs. This reduction in funding led to was a result of a lot of frustrations with these prior projects failing to live up to expectations. And then we see the emergence of the first AI winter, general cutbacks in AI R&D, and a general refocusing of research and development technology efforts to spaces other than AI. So what is an AI winter? This was a term that was actually formally adopted, or at least provided a definition by the American Association of AI in 1984. And I think it captures the characteristics, a sort of chain reaction where pessimism from the community produces pessimism in the press, followed by cutbacks in funding, and then the end of serious research. But with every winter comes a thawing spring, and so we see a new AI boom that starts from the period of about 1980 through 87. Mostly characterized in the form of what were called expert systems and a connectionist model of AI. So early forms of neural networks, building on additional developments in neurophysiology. And we see really kind of the height of this period in the Japanese government funding the 5th generation computing project, and DARPA in the US funding the Strategic Computing Initiative. But that is, of course, followed by a second AI winter when the LISP market, LISP were sort of single-purpose machines. That market collapsed as the PC came onto the scene and proved to be a very robust general-purpose computing device. DARPA canceled its spending on the Strategic Computing Initiative, and then we see the Japanese government quietly scuttle their 5th generation computing project's original goals. The funding dries up. Expert systems bottom out, and we're in a second winter. And then there's a more tepid gradual thawing the third time around. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you see a lot of algorithmic development and research programs and technology efforts by any other name but artificial intelligence. By that point, AI had sort of gone through these 2 boom and bust cycles, and there was a sense of it was a bit of a tainted expression to work on, and you could get funding if you called something AI. So you see informatics, you see analytics, knowledge-based systems, several other different monikers for what we would refer to today as forms of artificial intelligence. And then in the early 2000s, we enter the quiet spring period. Really, it marked this around the mid-2000s. We start to see people being less timid about calling their work AI, and more interest of the field and researchers and students pouring in. 2012, I mark as the dawn of the modern era of AI. We see a rise of computing power and low-cost computing resources, really fueling a lot of interest and development in the space. Lots of focus on machine learning, the revival of neural networks in different forms, building of advanced statistical modelings, and more broadly, this interactionist paradigm of being able to provide feedback for algorithms that are in operation. 2017, Google Research introduces the transformer architecture and attention mechanism, 2 key components that are essential to what we see now with generative AI. It took a few years to come to fruition, but in late 2022, we see generative AI kind of explode with this flurry of activity and interest in large language models and in other modes of generative AI that have sparked public interest as well as commercial interest. But the question remains, are there signs of a potential third winter? Are there indications that maybe this generative AI expansion, new forms of deep learning and neural networks may not live up to expectations? And I don't mean this talk to be a pessimistic talk. I'm actually generally an optimist. I think there's good reason to believe that this technology can provide incredible value, but that the development of the technology needs to be funneled in a direction that's constructive in order to get to those good outcomes. So part of this is a cautionary tale to take into consideration some of the emerging signs and avoid some of the traps and pitfalls of the past. But to get into an example of how we kind of continue to fall into the same patterns illuminated in the first step fallacy that I talked about before, you can look no further than I mentioned before. I'd return to Elon Musk. Let's look at Tesla. Tesla has represented, and Elon Musk in particular, has represented a series of statements that wildly over anticipate the pace of delivery of full self-driving or level 5 autonomous vehicles. The statements started around 2014, 2015 with Musk claiming that fully autonomous vehicles are just around the corner, maybe in a couple of years. I won't go through this in detail, but it's a fun exercise for me to look up these quotes every once in a while and sort of see the pattern emerge. 2016, Musk considers the problem to be largely solved. Predicts that a full coast-to-coast trip will be possible by 2017. It doesn't happen. Full level 5 autonomous vehicles within 3 months doesn't happen in 2017. 2018, same story. Skip ahead to 2018. We're still prognosticating coast-to-coast drive. That doesn't happen. By the middle of 2020, Musk is now predicting that autonomous vehicles will have improved to the point where drivers will no longer need to pay attention at all, and predicts that there will be 1 million robo taxis on the road within a year. That obviously doesn't happen. He's still in 2022 making the same predictions, and it goes on and on through 2021. More predictions about full self-driving beta 9.2. Skip to last year, Tesla is aiming to have its self-driving technology ready and available by the end of 2022. We're not there. 2023, you start to see some interesting signal coming out of Tesla as shareholders and drivers of Tesla vehicles start to issue lawsuits, as well as regulatory bodies pursue action, and Tesla's attorneys take this curious approach in a court case in Santa Clara County in California, claiming that some of Musk's statements may have been deep fakes, but we have a clear record of the past of these statements. And yet in the same month, Musk is still at it, except maybe he's a little bit hesitant. He says maybe this year the trend is very clearly towards full self-driving, towards full autonomy. And so you can take from that what you will, whether we're actually on the cusp of full self-driving vehicles. And I would argue we're not. And I'll say a bit more about why I think that's the case. But to make this argument, I need to get into a bit of philosophy. And I'll start the philosophical discussion with a historical touch point that I think will be familiar to many people, at least in some form. Folks have heard of Alan Turing, of course, one of the grandfathers of artificial intelligence and computing, and specifically of the Turing test. And a quick reminder, the Turing test was actually modeled off of a game that people played, a party game or a show on television. It's called the Imitation Game. And the idea is basically you have a man and a woman behind the screen, and then you have a contestant that doesn't see either one. And the idea is, can the man or can the contestant, through dialogue with those individuals, be convinced that the man is a woman or the woman is a man, either way. And you assume that you can mediate the exchange, so you don't hear voices, you don't hear any subtle clues that might give away gender. But the whole game is, can the people on the other side of the veil conceal their identity or lie in a convincing way enough that the contestant believes the person is not the gender that they claim to be. And so the Turing test posits that if you can take one of those contestants and replace it with a machine program, and that machine program can convincingly lie more frequently or with greater reliability than a human contestant, then you sort of demonstrated a form of human intelligence. And this is a sort of emaciated form. Turing, in his original paper, claims as much. He basically defers to this Turing test, or the Imitation Game, because he struggles with coming up with a full set of characteristics of human consciousness. And so he replaces it with this idea of, can machines do what we as thinking beings can do in the form of natural discourse and in conversation? Philosopher John Searle in 1980 posed a thought experiment that was meant to question the intuitions behind the Turing test, to see if the Turing test actually made sense. And the rough idea with the Chinese room thought experiment is, imagine you have an individual, a contestant in a game, who doesn't understand any Chinese, is not a native Chinese speaker, knows nothing about Chinese language or culture. You put this person in a room, you give them a guide that they look at, and basically you have an input, somebody on the outside of the room feeding them bits of Chinese text. For all we know, the person inside of the room views these as squiggles. They make no sense to him or her. But his task is to take these squiggles that come in on one side of the room, look up responses in a book that he has access to, and then take from that book a set of responses that are appropriate for those squiggles and push them out. Now, from the outside, the person on the right of this image, they might see this interaction as reflective of an intelligence that's actually operating in the system. But if we think about this isn't at all an indication that the person inside of the room has intelligence, or at least an understanding of the Chinese language. In fact, all they're doing is looking up and spitting out answers. Now, the intuition this is supposed to drive at is, suppose you take the person out of the room and replace it with a machine. Is there any reason to believe that the operation of the machine is any more a form of understanding or intelligence than this Chinese room? So if the person is capable enough of carrying out this routine to pass the Turing test, we wouldn't say he or she understands Chinese. So why would we say the same thing about a machine doing this process? Now, to be clear, the Chinese room experiment is not claiming that all machines are incapable of thought. Searle is not going this far. He's skeptical, but he's agnostic about the prospects of artificial intelligence. And he's not claiming that no man-made machines can think. He thinks there's a prospect that maybe we do figure out artificial intelligence. But his claim is that there's some fundamental barriers to intelligence, and the type of computing devices that we have access to don't solve this problem. He's saying that the type of information processing conceived of by the Turing test as carried out by digital computers may actually be fundamentally limited. And he makes this further point around a distinction between semantics and syntax. So you can think of syntax as the form of language, and semantics as the content, the rich experience that underlies the words that we use when we talk. This is actually a very important distinction that I'll return to a little later on in the talk. But I want to go into a bit of a deeper critique, a critique that's I think most poignantly made by another Berkeley philosopher called Hubert Dreyfus, and most prominently made this argument in a great book that I recommend to everyone called "What Computers Still Can't Do," is a second edition of the book, a critique of artificial reason. And he critiques this idea of humans as information processing machines that I want to get into in more depth. The crux of his critique is calling attention to very subtle qualities of how we operate in the world and navigate through our experiences and form information theories and interactions with the world. These are subtleties that haven't been captured, and in fact, we don't fully understand in a way that we've been able to capture in the operation of machines. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of these subtle characteristics include things like fringe consciousness. It's a sort of gestalt phenomenon to be able to look at an image on the bottom of the screen, and in one way of viewing it, you see a vase, and another way of viewing it, you see two faces looking together. But you can't see both at the same time. You sort of flip a switch and move between those. But the things that trigger this switch are any number of observations at the periphery of our vision. As William James remarked, there's millions of things we're aware of, but we're not really thinking about them in the moment, and yet they form the background of how we construct our understanding of the world. This is a very subtle point that's hard to emulate or simulate in artificial systems. Another thing that we as human beings do quite well that is very difficult to emulate is handle ambiguity. As Wittgenstein remarks, we're unable to clearly circumscribe the concepts we use, not because we don't know their real definition, but because oftentimes there is no real definition to them. To suppose, for example, that there must be like something that whenever children play with a ball, they play a game according to strict rules. Wittgenstein's trying to draw out this idea that playing games, there's no strict definition of games at all. We just do it, and we handle the ambiguity of interacting with ourselves, and we call it a game. But we can't actually define these things. But we operate all the time with minimal information, ambiguous spaces, and yet we haven't found a way to represent this ambiguity in machine processes. A good example of this in linguistics or natural language processing is the sentence, "the box was in the pen." This is a very simple, syntactically very simple sentence, but to make sense of it, it's very hard to make sense of. The actual context matters. Put this in the context of a story. Little John was looking for his toy box. Finally, he found it. The box was in the pen. The pen in here is not a pen that you write with. The pen is a playpen, a space in which children play. John was very happy. This is actually very hard to make sense of, and yet we do this all the time in our use of language for reasons that are oftentimes hard to describe, hard to formalize, hard to translate into machine processes. Another characteristic is the distinction between essential and inessential. Ability to distinguish between what's critical for information processing, for learning and problem solving. It's not something that we've been able to find good solutions to in programming AI capabilities. Because there's so much background information that we rely on, so many atomic concepts that form the core of our understanding of how to navigate the world that are very hard to program. And so to program them exhaustively, you end up having to almost create a model of the world that you can draw upon to construct a set of answers that help you navigate in artificial environments. So the broader point is that AI's problems go well beyond ethics and much deeper. They relate to core concepts of epistemology and metaphysics. And there's a number of assumptions that cause us to misunderstand what AI is capable of doing. The first is biological. We, computer scientists, want to think of the brain as discrete operators like transistors. The second is psychological. The computer scientists and engineers like to think about the mind as a device that's operating on bits of information according to formal rules, or with generative AI according to statistical or probabilistic processes. The third is epistemological, that all knowledge can be formalized. And that's to say, whatever can be understood can be expressed as logical expressions or as some kind of formal encoding. The final is ontological. Since all information fed into digital computers must be bits of information or bits of data, a computer model of the mind must in principle be analyzed as a kind of situation-independent program. All of these are fundamentally flawed ideas about what it is actually to be a human and to have a mind. They're flawed on the biological level because it's been refuted through neurology and neurophysiology that neuron firing is not strictly binary in the manner of a transistor. It's refuted on the psychological level because we have very complex attitudes and tendencies that constitute our psychological state, not just binary events that can be programmed. Epistemologically, we know that much of our human knowledge is not symbolic. It's actually situational. It relates to the experiences that we have on a daily basis and the context that we build up through many, many years of experience. It's flawed ontologically on the grounded in a philosophical tradition that confuses the world for the universe. The universe, we have physical models based on physics, chemistry, and the sciences. But the actual physical world we inhabit on a day-to-day basis is a world of experience that you can't reduce to a set of formulas and theories. What does this tell us? What does this boil down to? Well, it points to this idea that we are kind of fixated culturally on what some commentators refer to as a computational metaphor of the mind, that the mind is just a machine. But minds are not only computing machines. Yes, we do computation, we do mathematics, we do formal logic, but that's not the totality of what we do, and arguably it's not the most critical and essential parts of how we operate and navigate in the world. And so any AI that's built on this faulty assumption of a computational model as the understanding of what a human mind is, I would argue is going to struggle to fail to produce any real type of understanding or consciousness, if that's a concept that you want to treat as essential to real artificial intelligence. So some final critical considerations that I don't have time to go into, but I think they're relevant to the discussion. The first is this idea of dataism, reducing all information to data. Arguably, information is actually much richer than data. Data is a way of formalizing a capture of information out of the world, but it's not exhaustive about the information that we hold as human beings. And so if you can't actually deal with the information inputs in the systems that you're constructing, you're going to lose some fidelity in using information or data to model that in artificial systems. The human situated experience, what Wittgenstein referred to as Lebensform, is something that is a much more ambiguous and hard to codify concept, and yet it constitutes our experience of the world and life. A concept from phenomenology of skillful coping is this idea that we don't have set programs for how we navigate situations. Most of the time, what we're doing is through our attitudes and postures, kind of just doing the best we can to navigate very complex situations, what Dreyfus would refer to as skillful coping. Common sense, one of the biggest challenges of AI, it relates to a paradox called Moravec's paradox, that we've gotten really good at designing AIs to carry out certain types of what we view as highly sophisticated tasks, like playing the game of chess or the game of Go. But when it comes to walking around, robotics fail pretty badly at these tasks because they require common sense, and common sense is something that's much more complicated than, counterintuitively, much more complicated than sophisticated games or puzzles. There's a distinction between knowing how and knowing that. You think about this in terms of riding a bicycle. You can read a manual on riding a bicycle and understand the physics of remaining upright and the physics of torque. But that won't actually do you any good once you get on the bicycle. You actually have to do it to be able to ride the bike. You can't do it from first principles. There's complexity in language and recursiveness of meaning, makes it difficult to create set rules for language interpretation. And then we have the framing problem that I touched on before, Moravec's paradox. So a lot of the arguments that I'm making here are arguments that you could view as being against the thesis of artificial general intelligence or strong AI. This is the idea that roughly AI can be built that is basically like human minds. But some people may say, well, Courtney, nobody's really talking about, or not most people are not talking about AGI or strong AI. They're talking about weak AI. And we're talking about limited, narrow capabilities for artificial intelligence. But I would argue that a lot of the critiques and pitfalls of the attempts to build artificial generalized intelligence also impact our ability to make reliable, useful, merit-worthy weak AI capabilities for a lot of common tasks that we would like to see them perform. The problem is that there's a whole world of intentional cognitive states that can't easily be outsourced to machines, in part because we don't entirely understand how they work ourselves. And so for the reasons that I addressed previously, trying to codify those into machine learning techniques ends up being a really, really complicated task that it's a nut that we haven't cracked. And those states are essential to the practical and responsible application of AI. In fact, in order to address the ethical challenges of AI, we really need to understand what these fundamental limitations are. So you might ask, well, haven't we made a significant stride or significant strides in recent years, since 2017 and more recently in the last several months, through generative AI, through large language models? Have we solved the semantic gap, this gap between a syntax that describes how language works and the semantic value that it represents, that words, sentences, language relate to things in the world. Don't we get a little bit closer to solving this problem through these large language models that take the whole corpus of let's say the internet and train on all this information, and that potentially brings us closer to the world through this massive body of information? Well, I would argue that we haven't actually solved this semantic gap problem. There's still very significant shortfalls, because even though generative AI, I think, has some very, very impressive capabilities and applications, it still doesn't get us to a direct understanding of the world. And we see this in some of the issues and challenges that come out that have been broadly reported on. So most obvious one, hallucinations, confabulations. Why does generative AI hallucinate ideas? Well, because it doesn't actually know what's happening in the world. It just knows how to do this form of approximate recall, to use its trained model weights to answer prompt engineering questions and come back with something that seems linguistically to map to a response that makes sense, but actually doesn't have the semantic content of an answer that has truth value in the world that we live in. We see this in other places where generative AI fails pretty badly in, for example, planning complex tasks. It doesn't do this very well. We see all sorts of other emerging challenges, and models leaking private information that they've been trained on, and concerns around the use of intellectual property or copyrighted material to build these sophisticated and potentially lucrative models. So kind of coming to getting to closer to the end, what are the limits of machine learning that we take away from this long ranting diatribe that I'm presenting to you? Well, we're left with some questions. How should we think about how computers should be used for algorithmic decision making? What decisions are appropriate for us to hand off to computers? I would argue one of the guiding principles that we should take away from this is a clear understanding that computers, artificial intelligence, don't understand. They don't understand in part because we have the wrong model for what understanding is, because we've confused ourselves with the belief that our own brains, our own minds are computing devices, when in fact they're much more complicated in ways that we don't fully understand. That's not to say that we will never understand it, but we don't understand these things now. And so we have to move away from this belief that we can sort of build through this, replicating this first step fallacy. We can build a magical beanstalk that gets us to a promised land of artificial generalized intelligence. We have to start thinking about AI as something more mundane, more grounded, something more like a ladder. And even that, I think, is an idealized way of viewing what AI is. AI really is more like a tool that exists in situ in a specific environment. It's subject to brittleness, it's subject to constraints, it's subject to all of the real corrosive elements that define our own environment and experience. So concluding, the real world is complicated and it's constantly changing, which just adds to the complication. We're arguably a very long way from AGI, and there's lots of critical lessons that we have to take to heart, and considering that not just for AGI development, but for the use of narrow AI. And algorithms and machine learning, I think, are best thought of as tools, not as panaceas, not as a type of intelligence that can replace our own minds. And what that means is that we also have an enduring role and critical regard for things that we may struggle with, but have good institutional practices and good histories and traditions around. Things like legal reasoning and ethical considerations. Those are things that humans do well, because we've done these for thousands of years. But a more realistic victory of machine over humankind is something that we have to think about. A fantastic quote, again, going back to Hubert Dreyfus. I think the real risk for us in having a false conception about what artificial intelligence can do and not do is that we don't have super intelligent beings that arise, as some commentators have suggested, but we make instead sub-intelligent human beings out of ourselves. And with that, thank you, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Thank you. That's sobering. I think especially for the public sector, we have a big responsibility in deploying solutions. It's a good reminder that it's not a magical tool, and there is some tradition to tackle these questions. Yes, we do. I think we will take some time for a couple of questions also from Menti, from our viewers. And I think an interesting larger question is, how do you reconcile the deployment of AI solutions, of these tools, with the need for profit in the private sector, but I mean efficiency and whatnot in the public sector? How do you balance ethics versus value? And maybe, especially in the private sector, where do you place in the value chain? Where do you place an entity like yours? You know, the ethics board section division in a company.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. Again, my argument here is not to suggest that AI is an impossibility or that it has no value. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to situate that value and to make artificial intelligence truly value constructive. And so the way that you do that is by acknowledging the limits of the technology, as opposed to inflating its value and suggesting that AI is capable of doing things that it isn't capable of doing. What that allows you to do is, again, to think about artificial intelligence more as a tool that, for example, can create better productivity, can point people in the direction of more useful processes, can augment their tasks rather than replace their task, can augment human thinking rather than replacing the space for ethical consideration and ethical deliberation. And I think that answers the second part of the question, why and where you think about the role of an ethical engineer. Arguably, it fits into the full value chain of technology development. But I think you actually need people in roles and responsibilities of what I do at my company to help kind of navigate engineers and point them in the right direction, keep their efforts grounded, so that they don't get fixated on narrow problems, and rather focus on the big picture, building technology that is actually useful, that generates value, and then doesn't get caught up in a hype cycle that then deflates, produces an AI winter, and actually can be quite destructive to the broader industry, not to mention the fact that it fails to deliver on promises that have been made.
Thank you. And of course, I will ask you a question about privacy. Privacy concerns. AI systems, of course, need lots of data, collect lots of data, maybe from citizens. How can we make sure that privacy is guaranteed?
It's something I spend most of my career thinking about. I think one way we do this is to decentralize artificial intelligence, or the discussion around artificial intelligence and privacy, and think about the broader ecosystem. So artificial intelligence doesn't exist rarely can exist as a kind of separate component. It's more of a modular component that fits into a broader systems framework, where that broader systems framework relates to all of the traditional questions that we have around whether data is appropriate to be in an environment, whether it's been collected according to European laws or any jurisdictional laws around the protection of privacy or the protection of rights of individuals. How you manage that information over time, ensuring that it's accurate and of quality and consistent with expectations of consumers and citizens, and ensuring that the models that are built on the data, the applications of those models, and the user interactions with those models all reflect these kind of enduring ideas about fair information principles for handling data, for handling information systems. So all of these are kind of critical. And then we see new issues in the space of generative AI around privacy concerns. Understanding what the data is that's used to train these models is essential, because people may not have opted into having their private information used to build a massive generative AI model. So that we're seeing a lot of these kind of challenges emerging through litigation, through regulation efforts, to reassert rights, privacy rights of individuals, and to ensure that this next generation of AI technologies are consistent with those reasonably well-developed expectations for managing data.
Thank you. And I'm going back to dataism. That's about data that we collect. It's stuff we can measure, we can store somewhere. Do you want to say something about, especially with language, cognition? What is there that we can't measure, that we don't have as data?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So I think Yuval Harari is probably most prominent for having argued this point about dataism, that really all of the world can be captured in data. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think data and equating data and information is part of the initial mistake. The problem is data reflects a certain type of information capture through sensors, through information systems, through databases, but it's a kind of a flattening of the world. It almost mistakes the world for the map of the world. And with every map, we lose features, we lose fidelity. And so when you try and look at that map and think that you can reconstitute the entirety of our existence from the map itself, you've obviously gone through reductive exercise. And this fixation on the dataism paradigm, I think, is a kind of reflection of that category error. And that's not to say that data isn't valuable. Obviously, I'm work for a company that does a lot with data. And I think there's a lot of data-driven exercises that are incredibly, incredibly valuable. But the point is that you kind of need to put data in its place, and then also hold the broader landscape in view. So the role of human intuition, this broader sense of information, institutional practices, organizational practices, all become valuable supplements to the data landscape. So treating the data as one part of that broader puzzle is how you avoid this trap of dataism.
Thank you. And if you will, shall we end on the question raised by Raman Chaudhary? Do you think we need a global AI oversight entity, a bit like the Atomic Energy Committee?
I understand where the motivation for this comes from, but I think it's a bit of a narrow view about how we deal with the emerging challenges of AI, and particularly generative AI. I think a lot of this call is being driven by concerns around generative AI development. Generally, I tend to think about the most useful way to regulate AI is not as a technology, but rather as a tool in its appropriate context. So bringing the actual regulation closer to specific sectors as opposed to coming up with a more generalized approach. So in the near term, it may be a useful exercise, maybe even a necessary exercise to provide guidance for foundation model development, especially as those foundation models are increasingly rolled out in contexts that may create adversarial challenges or other risks. But in order to make these technologies particularly useful, again, the whole point of this discussion is to sort of situate and ground the technology in its context of use. And that, I think, requires a much more subtle, fine-grained precision tool to regulation. I don't think you can do that with a single standards body. I think you can set some broad expectations, but you need a lot more sectoral, industry-level consideration and knowledge in order to address the much more subtle, much more complicated issues that I think are going to be most impactful and consequential to people's lives.
Thank you very much for this closing remark. I have a question. Is the four-footed friend behind you responsible for the technical glitch that we experienced at the start? And again, we're very sorry about that. Thank you very much. No, he's not responsible.
No, he's not responsible. I think the machines were angry with me because of my critical view of AI.
Thanks again for your time. Thanks again for this great presentation and exchange. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.